My name is Alessandro Ferretti, and I was invited to share with you part of my research. Some time ago, we set up to try to understand a little bit better what is the connection between caloric estimations and perhaps looking at different models. In one of the chats I was having with Dr. Tommy Wood and one of my colleagues called Waco Jaros, which has helped me out in all through this process, was that sometimes the caloric estimation was great, but other times there were substantial mismatches, and this seemed to happen a little bit more for people that had embarked on a more low carbohydrate type of approach. So what we were looking and observing is that when people consumed a normal caloric intake, generally we looked at the match between the caloric estimation and what they were requiring in order to maintain the same mass, fat mass and lean mass, was within reason. Whereas when people embark on a low carbohydrate type of approach, then we started to realize that if they would count the energetic estimation in the same manner, unfortunately there was a substantial mismatch. So there is a message, just make sure that watching live, what do we do? Right, okay, thank you very much. So just making sure that the actual phone setup is actually okay, because I couldn't get a phone to actually have a different orientation from the Facebook, but now is okay, which is fine. So what prompted that this conversation was the fact that there are mainly two methods to calculate energy estimation. These are all based on calories. And this would be the additive model when someone has, for example, a certain metabolic rate, a basal metabolic rate, which we can measure in lab, and let's say of 2,000 calories. And then anything else they do during the day normally would be added to that, hence the name of the model, the additive model. So someone with 2,000 calories does a training session of, for example, 500 calories. This is what they would spend in the actual training. And then the total caloric estimation will be around 2,500. So that's the reason why it's called additive. There is a base with anything added on top. The other model that has been discussed in this paper was really, well, my view was actually was a great paper, was the Constraint Model. So there is a baseline, but given a certain increase of activity or a certain increase in modality of expending energy, the body will get up to a point, and then that will be a cap where anything above that, the body just becomes more efficient in extracting energy. Now, I have been researching ketogenic application and low carbohydrate paradigm in sport performance now for quite a few years. And interestingly, I have observed quite a few people making the transition, going from a normal standard diet onto a more low carbohydrate or ketogenic application. I have been involved in a couple of papers in ketogenic application and performance, one in high volume type of effort, another one in high intensity type of training, or what we were able to mimic in a lab. And I thought, well, something isn't quite right. So if we look at stoichiometric methods of calculation, in this particular case, the caloric estimation is given by a calorimeter. So as a very gross explanation, a substrate of a food is put in a calorimeter, and an estimation thought to be linear is given that a human body will make a certain number of ATP. So there is an energetic conversion between the two. Now, if we look at standard population, then that estimation may have been great. I mean, at college we studied that normally there are a double-digit figure, if not treble-digit figure of error in that estimation. And what we have speculated for some time till now, and now starting to have a little bit more of an understanding to explain these differences, is that when the substrate changes, the energy extracted from that specific substrate may also change the what we call the efficiency. So, for example, if you take carbons, which is at the end of the day is what the body tends to use in order to manufacture energy, when enters the mitochondria will produce heat, free oxidating radical, and obviously protons going through the layer and be condensed into complex 5 into ATP. So ATP is a carrier. So if this will be very linear, it would be great. We were told that, carbohydrates have 4 kilocalorie per gram, protein 4 kilocalorie per gram, and the fat would have 9, because it will be much more proficient in providing energy. Now, what we're starting to notice that when people are making the transition, in order to maintain their mass in pretty much the same levels of fat mass and lean mass, they actually required less calories. So is the energetic demand changed? Is the calorie or caloric calculation perhaps not so precise anymore? Is there anything that in the change of a substrate, going from primarily getting our energy out of carbohydrates or getting our energy out of fats, that has influenced the number of calories or the way how we calculate energetic requirements? And we definitely seem to think that the second one is true. So if you take, for example, a molecule of glucose that has 6 carbons, and you compare to, for example, one of the more simpler molecule, an 18 carbon molecule from a fatty acid, let's assume it's saturated for simplicity. So 3 molecules of glucose will give the same number of carbons as a fatty acid that is 18 carbon long. So theoretically the energy should be the same, whereas in actual fact it isn't. So this was our first discrepancy within the calculation, and with that assumption of linearity between carbohydrate and fats. So we know that obviously fats is more condensed, so automatically will yield more energy per mass, but we thought, well, there must be actually something else in relation to that. So what we actually seem to have stumbled across is in our view, very interesting in relation to people that would go on a low carbohydrate diet. And I'm saying low carbohydrate because sometimes it's higher protein, sometimes it's higher fat, sometimes it's a mix of the two. As Dr. Ted Naiman mentioned time ago, fat is the liver. So maintaining the proteins, let's assume that someone has worked out what is their protein requirement, and that is fixed. Then changing the proportions of the fats and the carbohydrate can actually change the equivalent in calories. And that's the reason why when we try to calculate, we make a distinction between what is the energetic requirement, and we feed that question, we answer that question in grams, and or what is the caloric equivalent. What we have noticed is that mitochondria, they are very efficient. They seem to produce more ATP, less free radicals, and less heat. This seems to happen also on a low carbohydrate diet. Without going through the whole potential explanation for that, I have a website where I collect thoughts and videos. It's all free, there is nothing to sell. And is my full name, alessandroferretti.co.uk. You can have a look at the type of research, but one is actually called Calorie versus FQ. And by FQ, we mean the food quotient. So we are actually starting to see at substrate more as the food quotient. So if you have ever come across the calculation of RER, or respiratory quotient, if you were to burn more carbohydrate, this quotient is close to the figure 1. If you were to burn more fat, then it goes closer and closer to 0.8. This is roughly, of course. And we started to consider foods as food quotient. So we have put all of this together in an app, which is web-based for now. If you go to Mitokinetics, so Mito as the first part of the Mitochondria Kinetics, spelled with a K.com. And once again, it's all free, but you can actually see all the some of the more interesting thoughts, and also the calculation, and how taking exactly the same calories but changing the proportions of the carbohydrates and the fats, you actually see that the calories, the caloric equivalent, changes quite substantially. This for us was fantastic, because this is something that I was never able, none of the models that we have used in order to calculate, especially in athletic performance, versus someone that is very metabolically inefficient, like type 2 diabetics, or someone that has insulin resistance, or someone that does not have mitochondrial efficiency at very high level, that provided us with a little bit more precise answer. And we are still at sea on trying to, fulfill every single possible scenario. But definitely we have observed a very, very consistent result in how the caloric requirement has to be changed. So for people that will still consider using calories, I would personally put through a few times onto our app to actually see how that would actually equate to a caloric adjustment. And my very original observation very long time ago with Waco Jarras, was that I said, look, in order for these people, they are very metabolically efficient, so they kind of fit more the constraint model. These people cycle for 2 to 3 hours. They don't actually feed the total calories, which a medium intensity ride would equal around perhaps 1,500 calories or something like that. It depends obviously which heart rate zone, but to get a round figure. If I cycle in order to recover from my type of training because I'm bruised or I'm just trying to keep circulation going, then I normally consume anything between 1,000 and 1,200 calories or kilocalories. I noticed that the more I integrated fasted ride to increase my biogenesis and all other kind of techniques in order to enhance my mitochondrial activity, including time-restricted feeding and etc. This was obviously in a training period, not ever in competition. My caloric equivalent and requirement were dropping quite substantially and then leveled out. And yet my mass stayed exactly the same, both for lean mass and fat mass. Whereas in people that are highly metabolically inefficient, this actually was not happening. And for us, this little app and this little system with our calculation allows people to have a better estimation. So if they're still counting the calories, they may have a slightly more precise estimation. Generally speaking, if you don't like to go onto apps and enter bits and pieces, normally we advise to do that maybe only for a couple of weeks. Normally humans are animals of habits, so once you measure 2 weeks, you roughly have a pretty good idea if you are within your macros. We prefer to use weight of food. So, for example, for me, I have my protein requirement met over however many meals I have in a day. I know my carbs, I know when I'm training is a different level of carbs, and the rest is fulfilled with actual fats. We are taking now this project a little bit further because I started to realize that people, when are inflamed and when perhaps there is a very strong sympathotonic activation, so very heavy stress response, obviously they seem to enter glycolysis very quickly. Some, for example, activated T cells are purely glycolytic. And there are some processes, for example, heavy inflammatory response that is very glycolysis driven. One of the other things I have noticed is that, for example, depending upon this type of sport, obviously carbohydrate will have to be utilized. There was a lovely podcast from Dr. Tommy Wood, one from Danny Lennon on Sigma Nutrition, for example, and they go through. Mike Mazzoli is doing quite a lot of work in that. So depending upon the sport, you may have to consider to massage the level of carbohydrates and have obviously an equivalent intake. So one of the things that we are finding now is, when do we want to selectively have a higher food quotient? And if you look into our app, there are two ends of the scale. So there is a kind of triangle, okay, and anything where the purple dot, that will be your diet. And depending upon where you are, you look across and you look at the calculations of your calories, so where your calories should actually be. Do bear in mind that within that triangle, by sliding the bar from fats to carbs, you will be in a maintenance mode. So if you see, for example, a less caloric equivalent is taking into account that you are feeding the body a higher fat percentage. Therefore, in order for you to maintain the same mass with no changes, that would be the equivalent in calories. So if I want to maintain my body, if the vast majority of my energetic intake is from fat, I may be 1800 calories equivalent. If I need to switch because of training or because of whatever that may be to a much higher level of carbohydrate, because my sport is highly glycolytic, especially if we go sparring at quite advanced level and forms and etc., then you actually see that the equivalent in calorie could be easily 2300. So there is a substantial difference. So now you can actually imagine some of the people that, because they are on a ketogenic diet, they claim they can eat as much as they want because they're burning fat. Well, that's not what we have found. We have found that given a certain time period where the body doesn't seem to respond to a much higher energetic intake versus the demand, after a while then things start to go very south. And I saw people on less than 30 grams of carbohydrates a day because they were just adding fats left and right and not really taking any care in the actual estimation of things, because calorie didn't matter. We have found some substantial metabolic derangement, including elevated blood glucose. At the end of the day, the fact that you may or may not have ketones in blood is very context dependent. So I'm talking obviously of a certain subcell population. That may not necessarily mean that you can eat as much fat as you want. In our understanding, if someone is very metabolically efficient, maybe blood ketones don't show up at all. And this is where the work of Robert Miller on the NAD plus and NADH ratio for the production of acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate has been, in my view, very, very, very interesting. So I just wanted to put this out there. We will keep researching this area. I'm very pleased that from a simple from my inability to understand why the caloric estimation was so poor in relation to what we were calculating, and obviously knowing my body very well, I thought, well, I'm eating 20 to 30% less calories in order to maintain the same mass. And that's the reason why I partnered up with Wei Kojaras, because he was not trained in nutrition. His kind of data analysis and engineering, so he wasn't kind of fazed by any old dogma of teaching. And I said, dude, what does the data tell you? Because this does not make sense to me. And he found also, obviously, some sense. So if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them, or if there is anything. I can't actually see any question here. I'm just trying to scroll it, but I'll be very happy to reply. I will be investigating other things that you may find interesting. One of them is a new formula where we have looked at now for quite some time. This came because I'm part of mainly two groups, a kind of heart rate variability group and another one that are low carbohydrate group, and where I call it the HIV group and the blood glucose group. So I started to notice some correlations between heart rate variability and fasting glucose, and knowing that one was obviously sympathetic activation as far as the heart rate variability, and to a certain extent the inflammatory response can correspond to a sympathetic activation, I thought, well, maybe we can have some form of prediction on what would be the actual blood glucose. And I did find a correlation which after adjustments it's around minus 0.7. So the higher is the heart rate variability, the lower seems to be the blood glucose. Unfortunately, I was also interested in what happened to the other 30% of the people. And so I put together a formula which, if you guys want, I will be very happy to actually share. If you want any more information on what I mentioned today, go to my website, alessandroferretti.co.uk. We're not trying to prove anything. We're just wanting to observe and understand better metabolism. So I hope that this was great for you.